Welcome back, curious minds. Today's story is not just unsettling, it's haunting. Imagine a palace so vast that its walls whisper secrets, a time when kings held absolute power not only over a kingdom, but over the lives of their own children. And buried somewhere within that gilded world was a little girl, a princess born into privilege, but sentenced to a life no child could ever deserve. This isn't just another tragic royal tale. This is the true, disturbing story of the princess, who spent 30 years locked in a cage, not by invaders, not by enemies, but by her own father. And why? That's what we're going to uncover. So grab a warm drink, get cozy, and prepare to travel back to a time when royal blood didn't guarantee freedom but sometimes ensured unimaginable cruelty. It began in the late 18th century. In the heart of Italy, a land of artistic brilliance, political tension, and royal grandeur. But beyond the bustling piazzas of Naples and the glowing ballrooms of the Bourbon court, a darker chapter was quietly unfolding behind locked doors. The Kingdom of Naples, under the rule of King Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, was no stranger to scandal. Ferdinand himself was a man of contradictions, rustic yet cunning, impulsive yet politically strategic. And he was married to one of Europe's most powerful women, Queen Maria Carolina of Austria, the sister of none other than Marie Antoinette. Together, they had a large family, children born into luxury and expectation. But not all of their children fit neatly into the roles expected of them. One daughter in particular, Princess Maria Christina Amelia, entered the world under ominous circumstances. Born in 1779, she was one of the younger daughters in the royal family. From the moment she took her first breath, whispers began to swirl around her. Something wasn't quite right, but in a court obsessed with image and decorum, any signs of difference were carefully concealed. As Maria Christina grew, her differences became harder to hide. She didn't speak the way other children did. Her expressions were vague, sometimes vacant. She laughed at inappropriate times. She was unusually sensitive to noise and touch. And though her physical health appeared stable, her mental and emotional development lagged far behind her siblings. The doctors of the time had no vocabulary for conditions like autism, developmental delays, or neurological disorders. To them and to the court, Maria Christina was simply strange, touched, as some servants whispered, broken, as others cruelly remarked behind closed doors. But for a while, she was tolerated. Her mother, Maria Carolina, was deeply involved in politics and statecraft. Her father, Ferdinand, was more concerned with hunting and fishing than with child rearing. So Maria Christina was mostly left in the hands of governesses and caretakers. She roamed certain quarters of the palace, often silent, often alone. But she was still a princess. She still wore silk gowns. She still attended certain royal functions until the day she didn't. Somewhere around the age of 8 or 9, Maria Christina disappeared from public view entirely. No official announcement was made. No illness was reported. She simply vanished from the court's social life. At first, people assumed she was unwell or being privately educated. But years passed, and then decades, and still nothing. No portraits were commissioned, no marriages arranged, no titles granted. It was as if the princess had never existed. What had happened to her? The answer, historians would discover much later, was as shocking as it was cruel. Inside the royal palace, deep within its private chambers, a section had been repurposed. Servants spoke of a sealed room, a place no one entered except for a few select maids and a shadowy physician. Behind those walls, Princess Maria Christina was alive, but caged. Not in a literal iron prison, perhaps, but in a locked room. With barred windows and padded walls, she was kept in isolation, her existence hidden even from many members of the extended royal family. And she would remain there not for weeks, not for years, but for nearly 3 full decades. Why would a father, especially a king, do such a thing to his own daughter? The reasons were layered, tragic, and deeply rooted in both superstition and political paranoia. In royal courts, appearances were everything. A daughter with visible mental or emotional differences was not simply an embarrassment, she was a threat to dynastic alliances. If word got out that one of the Bourbon princesses was mad, it could poison the family's reputation. It could jeopardize marriage negotiations. It could invite gossip that the royal bloodline was cursed or weak. And there was something darker. King Ferdinand was deeply superstitious. He believed that bad omens could infect a household. Some reports suggest he was told by palace mystics and so-called doctors that Maria Christina's condition was contagious to the soul, that if she were allowed to mix freely with others, she might spread her madness like a plague. Others speculated that a court astrologer had predicted that one of Ferdinand's daughters would bring ruin to the monarchy. Whether he believed it or used it as an excuse, the result was the same. Maria Christina was erased from public life, and yet she lived. Servants who had glimpsed her spoke of a thin girl with hollow eyes who muttered to herself in broken phrases. She was dressed not in royal silks but in plain, scratchy fabrics. Her room was sparse, containing only a small bed, a locked cabinet, and sometimes, according to rumor, a single doll. She was not permitted to leave. She could not walk in the palace gardens. She could not speak to her siblings, and she was never acknowledged by her father again. Her mother, Queen Maria Carolina, had once shown some affection toward her. But after the execution of her sister Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution, Maria Carolina's world grew dark and paranoid. Obsessed with revolutionary threats and driven half-mad with grief, she withdrew from family life and began focusing almost exclusively on political survival. Maria Christina became a ghost forgotten even by her own mother. Decades passed. The world outside changed dramatically. Revolutions rose and fell. Kingdoms crumbled. Napoleon marched across Europe. And yet, within the decaying grandeur of the Neapolitan palace, one woman remained trapped in time, a princess in name only, locked away like a family secret. There are heartbreaking accounts, mostly from servants' letters and later memoirs, that describe Maria Christina's moments of lucidity. Times when she seemed to recognize her caretakers. Times when she sang softly to herself in an ancient lullaby no one remembered teaching her. And then there were the darker stories, fits of rage, long silent spells, self-inflicted injuries, and tear-streaked pleas in a voice that rarely spoke at all. What makes her story even more devastating is that, by the standards of today, many believed she might have been helped, that with patience, therapy, and support, she might have lived a peaceful life, even found happiness. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was no such thing as empathy for the neurodivergent. There was only fear, shame, and the ever-present hunger to preserve the illusion of perfection in the royal lineage. Even when King Ferdinand eventually fled Naples due to political upheaval, he made sure that Maria Christina stayed behind, locked away in the southern palace like a living relic. Her cage, now dusty and aging, had become her entire world. And it wasn't until she was well into her 30s that her fate would finally begin to surface. But by then, the damage was already done. By the time Princess Maria Christina Amelia crossed into her mid-30s, the world she had been born into had changed beyond recognition. Monarchies that once seemed eternal were buckling under the pressure of revolutions, wars, and shifting alliances. The very idea of divine right was being challenged by ideas of liberty, reason, and human dignity. But within the crumbling stucco walls of the southern Italian palace where she was kept, time had stood still. The curtains were still drawn, the doors remained bolted. And the woman who once wore a tiara now lived with cobwebs for company. Her father, King Ferdinand, was no longer the ruler he once was. His power had waned. He had been chased from Naples by the armies of Napoleon, dethroned, restored, and dethroned again in a dizzying cycle of political instability. His priorities were now survival and diplomacy, not family. And yet, he remained committed to one cruel constant: his daughter's confinement. Perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of superstition, or maybe in his fading mind, she had simply become something less than human, an echo of shame locked behind plaster and stone. The palace servants, the only humans Maria Christina saw for decades, were not allowed to speak of her. Most didn't even dare to say her name out loud. But some, especially the older ones, remembered. They remembered a little girl in a yellow dress who used to sit under the olive trees humming to herself. They remembered her wide eyes, her awkward giggle, the way she clapped her hands at passing birds. And they remembered the day she was taken away, kicking and screaming, by order of the king himself. What happened behind that locked door during those 30 years remains partly a mystery. There were no official records, no diaries from the princess, and no medical charts that survived. But we know enough to understand the depths of her isolation. Her meals were passed through a sliding hatch. Her clothes were laundered elsewhere. The furniture in her room was replaced only when necessary, and always in silence. No mirror was allowed, perhaps because her caretakers feared what she might see or what she might do. Every now and then, a new physician would be called in under strict secrecy. They would observe her, scribble a few notes, and leave just as quietly. Some labeled her insane. Others believed she suffered from melancholia, a term used broadly back then to describe depression, trauma, or any number of misunderstood psychological conditions. But none of them recommended freedom. No one dared to. The king's order was absolute, and disobedience meant banishment or worse. The queen had by now lost herself in grief and aging bitterness. Her correspondence was laced with anxiety and fatalism. After losing her sister to the guillotine, Maria Carolina had become cold, erratic, and emotionally unreachable. The bond she once had with Maria Christina, if it had ever existed at all, had long since frayed into dust. She died without ever publicly acknowledging the existence of her caged daughter. As the years wore on, Maria Christina's body aged, but her world did not. Her mind, isolated from society, retreated deeper into itself. It said she spoke only in fragments by the end, sometimes in childish phrases, other times in nonsense. Occasionally, she would repeat a line from a prayer, or hum a tune from her early childhood, as if her brain was grasping at the only fragments of memory it had left. And then, in 1825, after nearly 3 full decades of imprisonment, her father, King Ferdinand I, died. His long reign had finally ended. With his death came a cautious wave of reform. His successor, Francis I, inherited not just a crown but a palace full of secrets. Whispers about the hidden princess began surfacing again, passed between the walls like forbidden scripture. A new generation of courtiers, less beholden to the old king's superstitions, started asking questions. Among them was a mid-level advisor named Count Alberto de Ragona, a man known for both curiosity and compassion. He had heard of the ghost girl from aging staff. At first, he dismissed the rumors as old palace folklore. But one day, while touring an unused wing of the residence, he noticed something odd, a thick wooden door with reinforced locks, one that didn't appear on any of the blueprints. He asked what was behind it. No one answered. When he pressed further, he was told only, "It's best not to ask." But he did ask. Again and again, and eventually, someone talked. What Count Alberto found when he finally entered that room would stay with him for the rest of his life. The air was thick and musty, the furniture sparse and antiquated, and in the corner, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was a woman, thin, pale, with stringy hair and sunken eyes. She looked up at him, blinking slowly, and then she smiled a small, crooked smile, as if unsure how to behave in the presence of another human. He did not recognize her. But when he asked her name, she whispered something almost inaudible. Christina, it was her. The lost princess, alive and completely broken. Count Alberto was horrified not just by the physical state she was in, but by what it represented. The monarchy had hidden one of its own for 30 years. Not for treason, not for scandal, but simply for being different, simply for not fitting their mold of perfection. Francis I was informed. At first, he ordered silence. No one was to speak of it, no one was to tell the public. But after repeated urging from more progressive voices in the court and pressure from European allies who found out about the scandal, he reluctantly agreed to have her relocated. Not freed entirely, but moved to a more comfortable and open residence away from the palace with proper attendants and caretakers. Maria Cristina didn't protest the change, but she didn't smile either. Her eyes had long since stopped registering joy or fear. She merely followed, like a ghost walking through the ruins of someone else's life. In her new quarters, she was treated with more dignity. She was given fresh clothes, a garden to walk in, and regular meals. But by then, the damage was irreversible. She spoke little. She trusted no one. She sat for hours staring out windows, humming to herself, as if waiting for something or someone who would never come. And then one day, quietly and without fanfare, Maria Cristina died. There were no royal processions, no grand public mourning. Her name was barely mentioned in official documents. She was buried in a small royal tomb, her title listed, but her life never truly acknowledged. The world moved on, just as it had done for every year of her invisible life, but her story didn't stay buried forever. Years later, as historians comb through dusty letters, palace logs, and fading memoirs, they began piecing together the truth. And what they found was not just the tale of one imprisoned princess, but a chilling reflection of how power, when combined with fear, pride, and superstition, can destroy the very people it claims to protect. Maria Cristina Amelia wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a threat. She was a daughter, a sister, a human being, and her only crime was being different, and for that she paid the price with 30 years of silence, 30 years of darkness, 30 years of being hidden from the world. Long after her death, Maria Cristina's name would remain a quiet footnote in dusty royal genealogies, a missing princess with no official cause of disappearance. But the truth, however long it stayed buried, had a way of surfacing, and when it did, it didn't just shake the legacy of one monarchy. It cast a dark shadow over the very concept of royalty itself, because what made her story so haunting wasn't just the length of her imprisonment, it was the ease with which it was covered up. For 30 years, she lived just steps away from lavish banquets, candlelit balls, and diplomatic audiences. Foreign dignitaries would stroll past her wing, never knowing that behind one particular wall was a woman pacing the same 4 feet of stone year after year, day after day, slowly unraveling inside her own mind. What happened inside her chamber was not just a failure of compassion, it was a carefully maintained system of denial. And it wasn't just King Ferdinand who played a role. The entire court was complicit. Advisors kept their silence. Doctors disguised the truth. Servants were sworn to secrecy, threatened with punishment or exile if they so much as whispered her name outside palace walls. Over time, her existence became a rumor, then a myth, and finally, a lie too inconvenient to address. But the world beyond the palace wasn't standing still. The 19th century was beginning to usher in new attitudes toward mental illness and human dignity. Enlightenment thinkers had already begun to argue that the so-called insane were not possessed or cursed, but simply people who needed care. In Paris, institutions were being reformed. In London, public outcry was rising against the barbaric treatment of the mentally ill. Slowly, across Europe, ideas were shifting. But within the Bourbon Palace in Naples, time had frozen. What's especially eerie is how the very architecture of the palace mirrored Maria Cristina's fate. Long corridors that led nowhere. Hidden doors, sealed off wings, rooms with no windows. The building had been modified to accommodate secrecy, and within that Baroque maze, the princess became a phantom, alive but erased, breathing but forgotten. Her entire life collapsed into that single cell. The rhythm of her days reduced to the sound of keys turning in a lock and the soft creak of footsteps that paused outside her door, then walked away. But even inside that confinement, there were traces of her personhood. A letter found decades later in an estate archive, unsigned and never sent, described a room of flowers drawn on the wall. A maid had apparently snuck in colored chalks, and Maria Cristina had used them to decorate her prison. Some said she drew scenes of gardens. Others claimed she wrote strange, spiraled words, fragments of a language only she understood. They were eventually scrubbed away during a palace renovation, But one worker remembered seeing a child's drawing, a stick figure with a crown, standing alone. Her art was not admired. It was treated like a symptom. By the time she was moved out of the palace in her final years, the damage done to her was total. The outside world was no longer something too long for, it was something she couldn't comprehend. The trees looked unfamiliar, the birds too loud, the sky too wide. Some attendants recalled how she would try to walk in circles even when in open gardens, as if her body no longer remembered what freedom was. One observer, a young physician from Sicily who visited her during this period, wrote in his journal, "She does not speak, but sings softly when the sun is near. She flinches from touch but seeks the warmth of light. Her eyes are dark, not from color but from sorrow." The people assigned to her in her final years were not cruel. In fact, by all accounts, they were far more humane than the court that had caged her. She was given books, though it's unknown if she could read them. She was offered music, though she only reacted to lullabies. And she was called princess once more, though the title now meant nothing. She had lived too long in anonymity to care for royal formality. Some have asked, could she have recovered? Could she have lived a normal life had she been treated differently from the beginning? The answer is unknowable. But what is clear is that she never had the chance. From a young age, she was defined by what she lacked, not what she might become. She was not trained, not educated, not loved in the way a child deserves. She was deemed unworthy before she ever had a chance to prove otherwise. And that not madness, not illness was the real tragedy of her life. It wasn't just Maria Cristina. Of course, throughout history, royal families around the world have hidden, exiled, or erased those who didn't conform to expectations. In France, Spain, Austria, and Russia, there are stories of forgotten sons and daughters, locked away or sent to distant convents. The practice was not unusual, but it was almost always hidden. Because to admit that a royal bloodline could produce someone abnormal was, in the eyes of monarchs, to admit weakness. Maria Cristina's case stands out not because it was unique, but because the truth eventually came to light. Years after her death, a palace archivist named Lorenzo Bellini began cataloging forgotten records in a remote storeroom of the royal residence. Among them were notes from an old physician dated 1790 to 1820, with coded language referring to La Filia Chusa, the closed daughter. He found logs of medicine deliveries, food ledgers, even entries from a servant payroll where a woman was paid a silent stipend for working in the locked wing. Bellini's findings were initially suppressed, but leaked pages eventually found their way to foreign historians. And once the story was out, it could not be undone. Documentaries were made. Books were written, psychologists weighed in, theories bloomed. Was Maria Cristina autistic? Did she suffer from a seizure disorder? Was she simply introverted, misunderstood in a time of ignorance? No one could say with certainty. But the one thing everyone agreed upon was that she should have never been imprisoned for being different. Today, there is no grand statue in her honor, no national holiday, no commemorative palace wing, but her name is beginning to echo again. In historical forums, academic journals, and even online corners of dark history enthusiasts, Maria Cristina Amelia is being reclaimed, not as a forgotten footnote, but as a symbol of what unchecked power, fear, and pride can do to innocence. In Naples, the room she was once kept in has been remodeled. It is now part of a library annex. Most visitors don't know its history, but if you walk slowly past a certain wall, you might still feel the chill. As if the silence never truly left, some believe her spirit still lingers, not out of vengeance, but out of confusion. As if she's still waiting for someone to tell her she can come out now, that the doors are unlocked, that the world is ready to see her. There is something profoundly haunting about that. Not because it's a ghost story, but because it's real. Because somewhere in the folds of royal silk and golden crowns, a young girl asked a question with her eyes over and over. Why am I not allowed to live like everyone else? And no one ever answered. In the decades that followed her death, The royal house that had once confined Princess Maria Christina Amelia would see its own decline. The Bourbon monarchy, already fragile by the mid-19th century, would eventually collapse under the weight of nationalism, revolution, and the unstoppable momentum of a changing world. The unification of Italy in 1861 swept aside the last remnants of that dynasty's rule, and with it, much of the history they had so carefully curated or buried. But history, as it often does, finds a way to reemerge. And the story of the princess in the cage has not remained a private shame. Instead, it has evolved into something much larger, a symbol of all that went wrong in the dark corridors of hereditary power. A symbol of the human cost behind the gold-framed portraits and velvety HRONES. As new generations looked back, the narrative of Maria Christina became less about a singular act of cruelty and more about an entire system that enabled it. It's easy to imagine King Ferdinand as a tyrant or Maria Carolina as a cold-hearted mother, but the more disturbing truth is that they were products of their time, shaped by a worldview in which image trumped humanity and control was valued over compassion. Ferdinand was a king who believed that his kingdom, and by extension, his family, was a divine order, not to be questioned. Anything that deviated from that order was treated not with care, but with fear, and so when one of his children didn't behave according to royal expectations, he didn't ask what she needed, he asked how to silence her. That silence stretched 30 years long. Maria Christina's siblings lived drastically different lives. Her brothers became military leaders, diplomats, or pawns in political marriages. Her sisters were married off to other monarchs across Europe, princesses, every sense of the word, and not a single one of them, so far as records show, ever publicly acknowledged their lost sister. Whether they were unaware of her fate or chose to ignore it remains a painful question. Was she truly alone, or did someone, somewhere in the palace, occasionally speak to her kindly, perhaps a maid who risked her position to whisper a story or sneak in a flower? Perhaps an old cook who left an extra dessert at her door? It's hard to know. But in the absence of official kindness, we are left to imagine the quiet rebellions of those forgotten souls within the palace, those who saw her not as a cursed secret, but as a human being. There is a bitter irony in the fact that Maria Christina, though locked away, became a mirror for the monarchy itself. Just as she was confined, silenced, and left to decay in a room that time forgot, so too would the royal family eventually find itself overtaken by the world it refused to understand. The same denial, the same refusal to adapt, would one day leave the crown itself as outdated as the stone walls of her prison. Today, her story is taught in some corners of academic history, often as a case study in early attitudes toward mental health or the lack thereof. Historians debate whether she suffered from epilepsy, schizophrenia, severe developmental delays, or trauma-induced withdrawal. But beyond diagnosis lies a deeper question. What would her life have been like if her father had chosen empathy over fear? That question isn't just academic. It's painfully relevant. Because even now, in the 21st century, there are echoes of Maria Christina's fate in how we treat those who don't fit our definitions of normal. Children with disabilities, people with mental illness, the misunderstood, the awkward, the quiet, they still face a world that often prefers to hide them rather than help them. The cages may look different. They may be institutions, or neglect, or cold stares in public places. But the isolation still exists. The difference now is that we have her story. And with it, the chance to do better. In recent years, small but meaningful steps have been taken to preserve her memory. A museum in Naples included a special exhibit titled The Lost Princess, featuring artist renderings of what her room might have looked like, alongside letters and reconstructed documents from the palace archives. Visitors are invited not just to learn her story, but to sit in a replica of the room, to hear recordings of what 30 years of silence might sound like. It's not a comfortable exhibit. It's not meant to be. It's a reckoning. One particular feature of the exhibit is a single doll, crafted from rags and straw, seated in the center of a glass case, has drawn quiet tears from visitors. It's Not confirmed whether Maria Christina ever had such a doll, but based on servant accounts, it's likely she clung to something small, something personal, something that reminded her she was still real, that she still existed. It is these tiny, human details that turn history from dates and titles into tragedy and meaning. A princess in a cage is not just a headline. She was a child, a teenager, a woman. Her favorite color may have been yellow. She may have once laughed at something silly, a bird on a windowsill, or the sound of a harp string. She may have dreamed, in whatever language she knew, of walking barefoot in the sun. She deserved that. In her silence, she teaches us how loud the absence of kindness can be. In her disappearance, she shows us how dangerous fear can become when combined with unchecked power. And in her turn to history, not through triumph, but through remembrance, she offers a rare and heartbreaking kind of redemption. Because we see her now, we tell her story. We speak her name. Princess Maria Christina Amelia of Naples lived 30 years in darkness. But she will not be forgotten again, and maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something she never got to have while she was alive. A world where difference is not a sentence, but a story worth listening to. A world where no child, royal or not, is ever locked away simply for being who they are. And as we close the pages of her history, one can only imagine if her spirit truly lingers, if she does wander those halls in the quiet hours. Perhaps now she smiles, knowing that she is no longer a secret. She is a memory. And memories cannot be caged.